In this lecture segment, we'll start a walkthrough of setting up the tabbed dialog that we showed in the introductory section. And we'll do that a step at a time, adding new HTML and CSS features as we go. For this walkthrough, I'm going to ask you repeatedly to make small improvements to the page we're working on. And to do this, you need to have a text editor up with the current HTML. Start with the supplied tabs v1.html. And do not examine later versions of tabs until you get to those as the lecture proceeds. So here's tabs v1.html in the display. But I also want you to load it up in Chrome, thus, for instance, and then have the JS Developers console open up underneath it, Control-Shift-I there, under the Tools menu. As I pose each in-lecture question, you're going to try to make the needed HTML and CSS changes on your copy here before looking at my answer. Playing around with CSS and HTML is the best way to get a feel for how it works. So let's start with the first version shown here. Notice what I get in the way of a display in Chrome, and then answer a couple more HTML questions on the code here based on your reading, either review or intro reading. First, what's line 1 for? And then second, what's the difference between the head section and the body section? And where would the title content here appear? Again, basic HTML review, coming back from a pause there. Well, line 1 announces that the document that follows is HTML, and browsers need that in order to properly interpret the HTML. If you're using HTML5 features, by the way, you need the doc type HTML5 up there. The head section gives general background information about the page, including, for instance, the title that will show up in the browser in the tab for the page, like that right up there. And then the body section gives what will be shown as the actual content of the page down in the web page proper. Now in the code, in that body, I've set up a div to contain what will be our tabbed window. Reference that diagram from the prior lecture. And within it are 3 further divs that I'd like to be the first row of tabs. Now, as you can see from the browser, we have a ways to go there, but we'll get there. First, a few questions in general, though. What causes the small gap on the left margin of the page over here? And what type of font is being used for the tab labels, and why? Again, coming back from a pause, what you should understand from your prior reading is that the style block has a body selector on line 6, and that style block thus applies to the entire page body. The font is of a sans serif, Helvetica kind of family, and the added margin is 10 pixels. Now, let's check out the debugging display as well here under Chrome. And the Elements tab is what we're looking at in particular. On the left, this shows an expandable tree of HTML elements. If we expand the div, for instance, for block 1 here, I'm beginning to think I should zoom that a little. Hold on. There we go. But remember, you should be looking at that yourself on screen as well. If we expand that, then we can see the tab divs underneath it, for instance. And for whatever element you currently have selected, the table to the right shows CSS style information. As you may recall from your background CSS reading, style propagates from parent to child elements in at least some cases, and keeping track of what element gets which style and why is an important part of designing and debugging HTML and CSS style. Now the style table shows the final style properties that apply to the chosen elements under computed style at the top, with the various sources for those styles down below. Let's look at the overall body element here. Under computed style, you can see style properties for its 4 margins, for instance. And they come from the CSS rules cited below it, down here, margin 10px, from our line 6 in our style block, of course. A number of CSS properties, like margin, automatically encompass a number of sub-properties, like the 4 margins at the top, left, bottom, and right, which can be individually set. Those are termed shorthand properties. Margin is a shorthand property. So expanding, say, margin bottom in computed style, we see again that the value of 10px comes from line 6, and that another possible value, by the way, of 8px was overridden. This comes, as you can also see from the style block way down here, from the user agent, which is another way of saying the browser itself. And had we not overridden the margin with 10 pixels, then the default browser-provided margin of 8 pixels would have prevailed. Now, question 3. Interestingly, the font type property does not show up in computed style. And looking down a bit, we can see that it's actually canceled out from our style block. Why? Again, to really answer this, you'd need to have your own version up and be kind of mousing around seeing what's going on. As this error triangle indicates, it's not a valid property. The style display also helps you debug errors like this. The right property name is actually font family. Let's fix that and show that it will be properly displayed. Pretty common error to have the wrong font name, as a matter of fact. So repairing that, save that, and reload it over here in the browser. And now it does show properly over here as font family. Okay, so how wide is each tab div in pixels? As a hint there, display their computed style information. It will tell you. And then coming back from the answer, well, we're going to have to select it first. And then it looks like about 909 pixels in our example, at least. It will differ depending on the size of your window. That's pretty wide. And you can see the element displayed also by mousing over it in the debugging window, which shows its rectangle on the page. Let's show more permanently the dimension of those tab divs by displaying their boundary. And so question 5 here. Note that they each have a class attribute, tab. Add just one style block that will give them all a solid border of 1 pixel width. Coming back from a pause there, all we really need to do is add a style block with .tab so that it will apply to any element that has a tab class. And then we need to put in border, solid 1px. And that should do the trick, I think. See here, reloading. And there we go. Now, interesting, isn't it, that all of them extend across the entire page. This is the default for divs. They're really a textual flow construct by default, rather like paragraph blocks, though they can be made into true arbitrary rectangles for UI design if we're sufficiently clever about it. So, let's make the tabs a standard smaller width. We'll specify the tab width in terms of the height of a typical character of the current font. Let's say 6 character heights worth. So there's your question for you. And you need to add only one line to do this. So coming back from a pause, pretty obviously we're going to be modifying the tab style again. And in this case, width will set the width of the div. And we're going to use a unit of 6em to do that. Save and reload. Yeah, okay. Now, there are a number of ways to define dimension size under CSS, including pixels, as in the body style block, where we used it for a margin, or percentage of the enclosing element, or ems, which are units of the standard character height. And the latter are useful if you want something to change size with the current font. Just to make the point, let's change the font size of our tabs. And I'll give this one to you for free here. We're going to put in font size and 125%. There's a unit in percents instead. This would be percentages of the normal font. And then save that off. And try a reload here. And yep, they're all correspondingly wider and taller. They're taller because by default they're tall enough to accommodate the text. So let's call the point we're at version 2 now. And that'll be tabs v2, which you can now look at, although it should be the same as what you've already built, in fact. And we will then evolve this to version 3. So our next step is going to be get those tab divs lined up left to right instead of downward the way they currently are. And to do this, please, question 6, add one more line to the tab style block. And you may find it useful if you need to reread the CSS documentation on positioning and float. So coming back from what might have been a little re-research there, what we need to do is simply add float left to the tab style block. And returning to the web page and reloading, we get that. Now, as you can see, it lines the tabs up left to right. Floating is often used for this sort of left-right alignment of divs, but as we'll see in a bit, it's a rather finicky feature. It's intended more for putting images into the margins of textual flow than for truly general alignment. If we squeeze the page width down far enough, for instance, the tabs start breaking across lines, as if they, or the way they would if they were a set of, say, marginalized images. Now, let's add a second row of tabs to go into the first. If we just add more tabs to the current layout, they'll go in the same row. So let's instead try to break this up by making 2 divs, one for each row of tabs, and putting 3 tabs within each row div. We'll even add a row class in anticipation of having to do some CSS magic to do this right. So let's see here. What I mean by all that was this sort of thing. A row div there. Usually use 2-space indentation with CSS. Lots of indents. And we're going to duplicate that and have another row with tabs 4, 5, and 6, thus. Okay. So, let's see what happens. Not quite. The second row shows to the right instead of below. Now there is still room for it to flow around the first row, so it doesn't need to go below. We need some trick to force it below. And this involves a style property of the first row to make the first row unfriendly to any content flowing around it, refusing to allow content to flow around it or to the right of it. So there's question 7. Create a new style block for just style row and put just one line in it to fix this problem. And as a very broad hint, go look up the clear property if you need to. Coming back from a pause there, what we need is to add the dot row here and put in clear both. Trying that out. We get what we're looking for. This clears both sides of the row from any flowing around text. It's a good example of what I meant by the flow mechanism being a bit of a hacked approach to getting UI layout, but it works eventually, I guess. And here's question number 8. Couldn't we have just made a clear both a property of the tab class? What would happen if we did this, and why? I'll just put the clear both here instead of that row thing I did. and do it that way. You should be able to predict what will happen if I do that. And just to reinforce by demonstration here, what will happen, of course, is that the tabs will all go one after another, because now they refuse to flow even around one another or next to one another within their own row. So by applying clear both to full tab rows, we solve this problem. It's a good example, by the way, of the frequent need to add more divs, often as deep as 4 or 5 levels, in order to get the layout behavior that you want from CSS. Now, those tabs have their text, if you look, run right up to the left margin. And that's a bit ugly. Yeah, there's also not quite enough space below and above the text either, and they do have a white background. So what I'd like to do now, question 9, is add 4 pixels of space above and below the text in each tab, 8 pixels to the left and right, and make the background color a very pale blue. And do that all by adding just 2 lines to the style block for tab. Coming back from a pause there. What we're going to need first is padding, and I'm going to do that with 4px and 8px, and then background color. Yet another property, and that one I'm going to use $DDF, which is a very light blue. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but first let's check it out, see what happens. Yeah, okay, a little more space there. Nice light blue. Several interesting things are being illustrated here. First, note that the margin property, which might have been something you considered, would not do the job. Padding is needed because it adds space inside the element instead of around it. The CSS box model describes in detail the various layers around an element, including internal padding, border, and external margin. Just to kind of follow up on that, I'm looking at the MDN material from our bibliography, CSS reference. Down near the bottom of the general page is box model. And there's the box model in nice diagram form. You want to be at least roughly familiar with this idea in order to get borders and padding correct. And the second major concept here is that the padding property, like many others, encompasses a number of sub-properties, just like the margin we were talking about earlier. Padding may be set on each of the 4 sides as an independent property. Such shorthand properties generally allow various lists of values to specify the way the sub-properties should be set. The to-value option for padding, for instance, sets the first value, or uses the first value, to set top and bottom padding, and the second value to set left and right padding. Other shorthand properties, like we said, include margin and also font. And the third point is that colors may be represented in a wide variety of ways in CSS. Choice of color is a big artistic issue, and the power of color notation in CSS reflects that. Be sure to look it up briefly, just to get a sense of what's there, and to know where to look if you need a subtle color choice. And to that end, here's an in-lecture question for you. How would I color an element background so that it is cyan with 50% transparency? Coming back from a pause there, one way would be to use the RGBA notation. I'll write it out here. And you're allowed to specify red, green, and blue. 0255, 255 is cyan, full green and blue intensity, and then an alpha, a transparency value as a fraction, 0.5 here, for instance. And you can't tell that it's transparent unless you put something behind it, but it would be. And that brings us to version 3 of our tabs page. In the next lecture, we'll develop that to version 4.